Hello, everyone, and welcome back to Let Me Finish here at Decision Desk HQ. I'm Brandon Finnegan, co-founder of Decision Desk HQ. Today's panel, I'm joined by Dante Chinny of the Wall Street Journal and Audrey Fahlberg of National Review. We'll get right into the heart of things, the start of things, the latest polls that have just been dropped as of the time of this broadcast. The Hill and Emerson College had a series of polls released today. Texas showing Donald Trump up by 5 points in Texas, similar to where he had landed in the 2020 election, showing him slightly closer in Virginia with Harris leading 52-44. In the Senate elections, we've seen some releases from Marist showing Gallego beating Lake by 10, 54-44 in Arizona, Cruz up by 4 from the Hill Emerson in Texas, 49-45 over Allred. And UMass Lowell released their presidential and Senate poll. Their Senate side of that shows Bob Casey with a 9-point lead over McCormick, 47-38. And lastly, Marist has a trio of polls they released at midnight on Wednesday, finding Donald Trump leading by 50-49 in Arizona and Georgia, and tied with Vice President Harris in the state of North Carolina. Well, speaking of the state of North Carolina, of course, there's been the drama with the gubernatorial election there. And with that, I am going to cut right on over to Audrey Fahlberg, who has been all over this with National Review. Audrey, what's going on in North Carolina?
It's good to be here today, Brandon. Yes, there's been quite a bit of drama. So last Thursday, I started getting a lot of phone calls and texts from my sources in North Carolina warning me that there would be a huge CNN story dropping on Mark Robinson. I didn't know the exact details at the time, but what I'd heard from my sources was that Robinson, his email address had been connected to some rather unsavory comments about race and sex on a porn site messaging board. A few hours later, even before the CNN story broke, the Robinson campaign sends me a video statement of him denying the allegations, again, before the story comes out. Then the story drops, and it is a real zinger. So he, according to the email address connected to the porn site account, again, he has denied these allegations. He, according to those comments on the messaging board, he called himself a black Nazi and defended slavery. And that is just the beginning of, you can look up the report and some tweets about it, about some other things that he allegedly said. But again, this is not a surprise to reporters who've been covering North Carolina for a while. A year ago, when I was still at the Dispatch, here's how I described his soon-to-be gubernatorial candidacy, Robinson. And he's, of course, the sitting lieutenant governor of North Carolina. Many Republicans know Democrats have amassed an opposition research file that could be leaked at any time. Even Robinson seems worried about more potentially damaging revelations coming out. And then I'd caught wind for that story of a voicemail he left on a prospective donor's phone, acknowledging the rumors that were, quote, swirling around with him. Again, this is a year ago. And then the hits just kept coming. I mean, over the weekend, 8 of his staffers on his campaign resigned. A few days later, half of his lieutenant governor staff resigned in his official office. I scooped a few days ago, earlier this week, that the Republican Governors Association, which is, of course, the group that elects governors in this cycle, has stopped ads, which is a huge deal because North Carolina is seen as their best pickup opportunity this cycle. A couple of things to know before we get to whether this matters at the top of the ticket is that, this North Carolina, while it typically leans red on the presidential level, and of course in many congressional races, the governorship actually tilts toward Democrats, which is pretty interesting. So it was still seen as a tough race, no matter who the candidate was. And it was really going to be difficult to knock him out of this primary, given, again, he is the sitting lieutenant governor. And he had support from Trump, and the people who ran against him didn't have that grassroots appeal. But it is a real barn burner of a story, and just a few weeks out from Election Day. Of course, the story from CNN also dropped on the dropout deadline, which didn't really give that much time for Republicans to scramble and find a new candidate. Republicans continue to tell me they're concerned that this will really affect down ballot races, but they're not quite as convinced that it will hurt Trump's chances in North Carolina. And of course, that race is, I'm sure Dante, you and Brandon will note, is continuing to narrow with Kamala Harris in the race. But I'm curious to hear your thoughts on whether you think this will really hurt the top of the ticket.
Yeah, so I don't know, like this reverse, it would be like the reverse of anything in this kind of situation, right? Normally, something at the top works down, something on the lower line affecting on the top. It's going to have to be a close race. It's going to have to be a really, really close race. But then again, it is 2024 and everything's close. I'm in Michigan right now, and people always ask me, what about the Muslim vote in Dearborn or the Arab vote in Dearborn in Michigan? Will it matter? And my answer is always, look, if the race is close enough, anything matters. So could it matter in North Carolina? It'd have to be really close. I mean, you're talking about a race that was pretty close last time, pretty darn close. Close enough for this to matter? I don't know. Again, we'll have to see where the polls move on it. I'll put it this way. I'm skeptical. I actually have one question for you, Audrey, because the fact that they dropped the story, I love the fact dropped it on him, because they really didn't drop it on him. This like came like a ton of bricks. If this had dropped earlier, would there have been a movement? Would he have stepped aside? Would it have been a possibility?
It was always, again, it was just so tough because back in December, I scooped that Tom Tillis was endorsing, I think this was December 8th when the story came, endorsing Bill Graham, who's an attorney. I think he'd run for governor before, if I remember correctly. And he spent millions of his own money trying to win this race, and he still barely got anywhere. Dale Folwell, state treasurer, they just were so far behind him in the polls. In North Carolina, as I'm sure you both know, the state legislature really pulls the strings there. And the head of the Senate, Phil Berger, there, he was supportive of Robinson's candidacy, and most other Republicans were. And of course, Trump was as well. It's also interesting seeing the fallout. Trump has not really, correct me if I'm wrong, I don't think he said much of anything. He about Robinson since the story broke. He rallied in North Carolina over the weekend. Robinson was not there. But it's interesting to compare that to how governors have reacted. Again, the RGA cut ad spending, additional ad spending. As I reported the other day, there's a fundraiser with Robinson's team that was originally scheduled to be earlier this week with Bill Lee, who's the chairman of the RGA. They scrapped that. That was called up yesterday, or maybe it was the day before. I reported that Glenn Youngkin also has no plans to further support his candidacy. Brian Kemp and Henry McMaster, the governors of Georgia and South Carolina, have also distanced themselves. So while governors are distancing themselves because they already see his candidacy is a lost cause now, Trump's not saying much. But again, Trump is really his own candidate. Voters are used to him, and it's unclear whether that will really have an effect, in my view, on the presidential race. But again, down the ballot, that may have an effect.
In the state of North Carolina, we've already had examples of ticket splitting between the governor's race and the presidency. We've had it twice in a row, right? 2016 and 2020, where Donald Trump won and the Democrat won for governor. And it happened again for governor. So you already have that as an existing baseline. There is some potential upside to letting the fruit just wither on the vine, so to speak. If you pull out all the money, pull out all the attention, less attention that's given to him, the more it's just about his race. He falls apart. Everybody else in the ticket's okay. I do want to bring up that, showing my age here, I remember in 2012, the walking, talking disaster that was Todd Aiken, who won a U.S. Senate primary in Missouri, and was everything out of his mouth was another headache for the GOP. That had no impact on Mitt Romney winning the state handily in Missouri. Claire McCaskill beat Aiken by 15 points, but Romney carried the state by double digits. He was fine. It was a 26-point swing. People will split their vote if there's someone who's just so noxious that they're not going to vote for them. And I'm with you, Dante. I'm very skeptical of reverse coattails.
Yeah.
Right. It takes a lot of effort for you to be so incredibly toxic that you hurt everyone above you. Look, both parties have done this for years, where they'll highlight a really atrocious candidate that's running for office in, say, a state Senate seat or even the U.S. congressional seat, and then paint the broad brush saying the whole party has to answer for it. Well, no, that's not how either party reacts. The best way is you just ignore the person who's terrible, you cut off their money, you let them fall apart, and then you carry on with your own election. So I would be highly skeptical that it ends up hurting Trump in North Carolina. So, and the other thing is the presidential polling in North Carolina, while it has remained tighter, it seems like it's been kind of wobbling a little bit more slightly to the right versus where it was a couple of weeks ago. And that's with some surveys that have been conducted since this thing. And this is just the latest, this huge bombshell. It's not like this came out of the blue for him. He's had a mouthful of statements for a year that have garnered terrible reactions for him, that have hurt him in the polls. So after a certain point, when someone is just a walking, talking bomb, Eventually, you're going to get to what's called your core support. They're going to keep polling at that core support. They're not going to fall through their basement. That's what they're going to get, and that's
Right.
really what he's been getting for a consistent amount of time throughout this cycle. And I
Yeah,
think that he's going to land there.
and the other thing is, like, Trump's not going to say anything because, to Brandon's point, just let it fly in the wind and die on its own. Trump, for him to come out and say something, he'd have to do the thing he likes to do least, maybe of all, which is admit he was wrong. He's not going to do that. He'll just say nothing.
Speaking of races and money, we talked about money earlier with North Carolina and people pulling it out. One thing that's interesting today is that the Democrats have finally decided to invest in Texas and Florida for the U.S. Senate. Now, while they'll talk about an expanding map, polling opportunities, I think the writing is on the wall for everyone that can look at the numbers that are coming out of the state of Montana, where John Tester is in the fight of his political life here. Yes, he polled narrowly in previous elections, but that's the key. Narrow polling in the previous elections, not growing to blowouts now in the recent polls. In 2012, the final polling average had his opponent in 2012 had Reberg up by like a fraction of a point. Tester won by about 3.5. 6 years ago in 2018, in fact, there was no late polling that showed Rosendale leading at all. It all showed narrow leads for Tester. Tester won by nearly the exact margin he was predicted to win. Well, now things have changed. He is now underwater in the average. He has been underwater by 6, 7, and 7 in the three most recent polls out of Montana. There doesn't seem to be any really good news coming out of Montana. And from my perspective, this is a strategy of acknowledging, look, we're not going to hold our majority here. We've got all this money. Let's just throw it wherever it looks somewhat loose. Dante, what are your thoughts?
So, I mean, if you think about it, it makes sense for obviously all the reasons you said. Montana, I think, is going to become harder and harder for Democrats just because there's only one Bozeman and there's only one Missoula and there's a lot of the rest of the state. And that's hard. That's really hard to overcome. And Tester could do it for a while. And it may just be, we're at the point now where, whatever is happening in Bozeman and Missoula, the rest of the state has just turned too much against. So if you're a Democrat, if you're the Democrats, you think about where do we spend our money? Look, Texas, Ted Cruz is always on the verge of, Ted Cruz is in danger. Ted Cruz is in danger every cycle, yes. And then somehow he ends up pulling it out. I will argue the one thing I would argue about Florida is because of the abortion initiative, maybe, it's a close race. Maybe it feels different. I don't know. But for the Democrats, we talked about this a little before we came on. You got the money. Why not at least, expand the map and throw it on some, I don't want to say I wouldn't even say they're super long shots, but these are bets where you're going to need a lot of things to fall right for you to win these states.
And I imagine that the hurricane that is about to strike Florida is not going to help them, because then all you need is Rick Scott in a vest going around disaster areas talking with people, and he gets another 5 or 6 points added to his margin, which we've seen in previous elections for incumbent Republicans who run for office in a lot of these states that get hit with hurricanes.
That said, the one thing, if they botch the response, now I know that's not going to be Rick Scott's fault. That's a federal government situation, but you never know. Things get weird.
There could be. I think that this seems like a good place to wrap right here in terms of at least where everything is on the ground. I'm sure we're going to see a plethora of new polling next week. There is going to be the vice presidential debate that's coming up on October the 1st. Everyone's going to be looking at that, seeing how that impacts the election. I will give you all a preview right now. If anyone wants to know in a crystal ball, it won't matter. But we'll all pretend it does, and I'm sure we'll be back here to talk about it next week. So, for
so much more dramatic story that way.
As we're wrapping things up, as always, like and subscribe. We're always throwing up videos here twice a week here on the Decision Desk HQ YouTube, and you can find all the latest news and analysis of elections on DecisionDeskHQ.com, including live election results during the November general election on November the 5th, and we hope that you're tuning in to watch that. So, for Dante Cini, for Audrey Fallberg, and for myself, Brandon Finnegan, thank you so much for watching, and we'll see you again.